Welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're exploring lissencephaly and cerebellar hypoplasia.
LCH.
LCH, right? In a group of lambs from Australia.
Yeah.
We've got this new article straight from Veterinary Pathology. And
Hot off the presses.
yeah, and it really gets into the details of how these neurological problems developed.
I think what's really cool about this article is this is the first time that we're seeing LCH in sheep that aren't Churra breed sheep.
Oh, interesting.
So until now,
Okay.
LCH has only been reported in Churra breed sheep.
So just in one breed. Got it.
So this is kind of expanding what we know about this condition.
That's fascinating. So they started with 3 lambs that couldn't walk from birth.
Right.
One of them even developed like a hypermetric gait and intention tremors
Yeah.
later on.
As it got older.
Yeah, as it got older.
Yeah.
And even one of the lambs had reduced vision.
Yeah, it's really interesting because even within the same litter, we see that there's a lot of variability in how this condition presents.
Wow, so these symptoms are kind of pointing to some pretty major neurological issues. What did they see when they actually looked, I guess, closer?
Yeah, so as you might expect with LCH, they saw a smooth cerebral cortex on post-mortem exam. So that's that classic lissencephaly part of the diagnosis. And then they also saw a much smaller cerebellum than what you would expect, confirming that cerebellar hypoplasia part.
I see. Okay, so pretty clear cut from like the bigger picture, macroscopic level.
Yeah.
What about when they looked at the tissues under the microscope? What did they find there?
Yeah, so then things got even more interesting. They found that the neurons were disorganized within the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus. So remember, the hippocampus is really important for memory, spatial navigation.
Right.
And then the cerebellum, which we know is responsible for coordination and movement, was also affected. They found that the gray matter there was disorganized and that the Purkinje cells, which are those really important cells that kind of drive the function of the cerebellum, were misplaced.
It sounds like just kind of a developmental mess.
Yeah.
Did they use any special techniques to kind of visualize that?
Yeah, so they used a technique called immunohistochemistry, which is often shortened to IHC. And it's basically like highlighting specific cells within the brain tissue. So they used a marker called NUUN, which binds to a protein that's found in most neurons. So that let them see the neuronal organization. And they were able to look at that in more detail in both the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and it was really obvious from looking at these images how disrupted the brain development was.
Wow, okay. So that's a good way to really highlight those structural abnormalities. But knowing what's wrong doesn't always tell you why it happened.
Right.
So did they try to get to the bottom of what actually caused this developmental disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. They weren't satisfied with just knowing it was wrong. They really wanted to figure out why. And so that's where whole genome sequencing, or WGS, comes in.
WGS, that's basically like reading the entire instruction manual, right?
Is
Like the whole DNA, all of it.
Yep, you got it.
And looking for any errors.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so they were able to use that. And did they find anything?
They did. They found that there was a specific missense variant in the RELN gene.
Okay, and remind me, why is the RELN gene so important?
So the RELN gene has the instructions for making the RELN protein, and the RELN protein is super important for neuronal migration during development. So it makes sure that all the neurons are in the right spot and the right time.
Okay, so if it's messed up, then you're going to have problems.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
So they found that, and did they do anything to confirm it?
Yeah, so they did Sanger sequencing to confirm that all 3 of these lambs were homozygous for this variant in the RELN gene.
Homozygous, meaning they got the same mutation from both parents.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is the sire of the lambs, so their dad, was heterozygous for the variant. So that means that he had 1 copy of the normal RELN gene and 1 copy of this mutated gene.
Wow, so it seems like pretty strong evidence that this is the cause of the LCH.
It really is.
But how does it actually affect the RELN protein?
That's the million-dollar question, right? So we know what's wrong with the gene, but how does that actually translate to problems with the protein?
Right, because the protein is what's actually doing the work.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Let's do it. So this particular RELN variant, it's a missense mutation.
Okay.
So that means a single nucleotide in the DNA has been swapped, which changes the amino acid that gets put into the RELN protein.
So instead of like arginine, it's...
Yeah, so in this case, it's an arginine that's being replaced with a histidine
Okay.
at a specific spot.
Got it. So it's like in a recipe,
Yeah.
swapping one ingredient,
Yeah.
and it
That
might
have a big impact.
look the same, but
Right.
but taste totally different.
Exactly. So for proteins, even just changing one amino acid can totally change how it works and how it's shaped.
Oh, wow.
So to get to the bottom of that, the researchers did some protein modeling.
Protein modeling, is that like where you build a...
Yeah, it's based using computer simulations to figure out like what the protein looks like in 3D
Oh, cool.
and how stable it is.
So you can see how that one change would affect the whole thing.
Yeah, you can see if it makes the protein like more likely to fall apart or if it changes how it interacts with other molecules.
Got it.
And what they found from this, what's called an in silico analysis, which basically means doing it on the computer.
Okay.
They predicted that this arginine to histidine change would make the RELN protein less stable.
So less stable, does that mean it breaks down easier?
It can, yeah. So, proteins are kind of like these really complex origami structures.
Right.
They have to fold in a really specific way to work.
Right.
And if they're less stable,
Okay.
they might not fold the right way.
Gotcha.
Or they might be more likely to get degraded or broken down in the cell.
Okay, so it's kind of disrupting that whole delicate balance.
Yeah, you got it.
Making it harder to do its job.
Exactly. And remember, its job is to guide the neurons during development. So if that's not working right, you get all those developmental malformations.
Right. All that chaos we were talking about.
Exactly.
So, okay, we've got the RELN gene.
Right.
We know this mutation messes it up. How does RELN actually work? How does it guide those neurons?
So RELN is a really cool protein, and it does a lot of things in the developing brain.
Okay.
One of the most important things it does is it acts as a stop signal for neurons as they're migrating.
So they're moving along, and RELN's like...
Yeah, like, stop here.
This is it.
This is your spot.
Get off the train.
Yeah, and then the neurons can kind of get off and start making connections with their neighbors.
So that's how the layered structure of the brain gets established, telling them what layer to be in.
Yeah, so that's super important, especially in the cerebral cortex,
Yeah.
which is that outer layer of the brain that does all the high-level thinking and planning. But RELN is also important in other areas of the brain, like the hippocampus. Remember we talked about that for memory.
Yeah.
And the cerebellum for coordination.
Got it.
So if it's not working right, it's kind of like those neurons miss their stop.
Right.
They end up in the wrong spot.
In the wrong place.
Yeah, exactly.
They can't do their job.
Yeah, and they can't make the right connections. And so that's how you get, what we're seeing with these lambs. The messed up RELN is leading to disorganized brain structure, and that's why they have the symptoms.
Okay, so we know that RELN's super important.
Yeah.
Did they look into any other possible causes for these problems?
Yeah.
Or were they pretty confident it was the RELN?
Yeah, they were very thorough.
Okay.
They looked into, infectious diseases that can cause brain problems in lambs, like border disease virus, Simbu viruses. They also checked for copper deficiency.
Okay.
Which can also cause neurological problems in sheep.
And all those came back negative?
All negative. So that makes them even more sure that this RELN mutation is the culprit.
So really, they checked off all the boxes?
Yeah, it was really like a detective case, and all the clues pointed to RELN.
Okay, so this is super interesting for these lambs, obviously.
Yeah.
What about, the bigger picture?
Yeah, what does it mean for, beyond just these lambs?
Exactly.
Well, first of all, it shows us that LCH isn't only a problem in Churra sheep.
Oh.
Remember, this is the first time it's been reported in another breed.
Right.
So that suggests that maybe RELN mutations could be more common than we thought as a cause of LCH.
So we still have a lot to learn about genetics.
Yeah, for sure.
And how it plays into all these different conditions.
Absolutely.
But it goes even beyond sheep, right?
It does.
Because RELN is important in lots of different species.
Yeah. So RELN is what's called highly conserved.
Okay.
Which means it's very similar across a bunch of different animals, even humans.
So what we learn in sheep could help us understand humans.
Could totally apply to humans and other animals too.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really neat.
So what could we learn from this then?
Well, in humans, RELN mutations have been linked to several neurological conditions, like lissencephaly, autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia.
So these lambs are helping us understand some pretty major human
They really are.
Brain disorders.
It's amazing, right?
That's fascinating.
Even though, obviously, sheep brains and human brains are different.
Right, they're not the same.
But the basic processes of development and a lot of the genes involved,
The fundamentals.
yeah, they're very similar.
That's so cool.
So it's really cool to see how we can learn so much from these animals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we know this mutation is out there,
Right.
can we do anything to prevent it?
That's the real question, right?
Yeah.
Well, the good news is
Great.
now that we know this RELN mutation causes LCA, we can actually start thinking about screening for it.
Oh, like genetic testing.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, great.
So breeders could test their animals,
Okay.
see if they have the mutation, and then make better choices about breeding.
So we could actually reduce
Yeah.
the number of lambs born with her.
Really reduce the risk of having LCH-affected lambs.
That's incredible.
It is.
Like taking all this information and
Yeah.
actually making it useful.
Yeah, translating it into something practical.
Wow. And this is just the beginning.
This is really just the start.
I'm excited to see where it goes.
Me too.
So this is really exciting for sheep, but like, what can we learn about our own brains from this?
That's a really good question because even though sheep brains and human brains are different, obviously,
Right.
the way they develop and a lot of the genes involved are really similar
Okay.
across all mammals.
So these lands are actually teaching us about human brain development.
In a way, yeah. They give us this unique opportunity to see how brain development can go wrong.
Right.
And by studying them,
Yeah.
we can learn more about how RELN works, how it guides neurons, how the cortex forms, how those connections are made.
It's amazing that they can teach us so much.
Yeah, and what we learn from them can help us develop better ways to diagnose and treat brain disorders.
In both animals and people.
Exactly.
It's pretty incredible that we started with these lambs that couldn't walk.
Right.
And now we're talking about like major breakthroughs in brain science.
Yeah, it really shows how interconnected everything is and how much we can learn from studying animals.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been fascinating.
I agree.
We've learned so much about brain development, genetics, and the importance of RELN.
Yeah, and it's a great example of how veterinary research can help us understand human health.
And how every living thing has something to teach us.
For sure.
From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.